Burn it, and you'll destroy your future. The warning echoed across the packed square, but Aloan Ashcroft did not let go of the parchment in her hands. The night air smelled of pine, smoke, and approaching rain as hundreds of wolves stood shoulder to shoulder beneath strings of lanterns swaying gently in the wind. At the center of Moonridge Pack, beneath a silver moon hanging over the mountains, every eye was fixed on her. The mating contract trembled slightly between her fingers, not from fear, from anger she had carried for years. The parchment was thicker than ordinary paper, marked with ancient symbols and sealed with crimson wax bearing the crest of Magnus Thornvale, heir to the pack. To everyone gathered here, it represented honor, stability, and tradition. To Aloan, it felt like a cage. The crowd waited. Elders sat in carved wooden chairs near the ceremonial platform. Families whispered behind folded arms. Young wolves exchanged curious glances. Nobody expected resistance, especially not from an Omega, especially not from Aloan Ashcroft. For most of her life, she had been known as the quiet girl, the obedient girl, the girl who accepted every insult with lowered eyes and silent dignity. She had learned early that speaking rarely changed anything. The powerful made decisions. The weak lived with them. Tonight was supposed to be no different. Magnus Thornvale stood several feet away, dressed in formal black attire trimmed with silver. His confident smile suggested the evening was already finished. The contract was prepared. The witnesses were present. The elders had approved everything weeks ago. All Aloan needed to do was sign her name. Yet something had changed. Perhaps it was the memory of every choice made for her. Every door closed before she could reach it. Every conversation where others discussed her future while she sat silently nearby. Or perhaps it was the strange certainty growing inside her chest tonight. A certainty she could not explain. The elder conducting the ceremony cleared his throat. Aloan Ashcroft, he announced. Do you willingly accept the terms of this sacred agreement? The crowd grew still. Even the wind seemed to pause. Aloan lowered her gaze to the parchment one final time. The words blurred slightly under the lantern light. Sacred agreement. Future union. Duty to the pack. Beautiful words hiding an ugly truth. Her pulse quickened. Not with fear. With clarity. Somewhere near the back of the crowd, she felt it again. That strange sensation. The feeling of being watched. She lifted her eyes. Rows of faces stared back at her. Curious. Judgmental. Impatient. Then she saw him. A man standing apart from everyone else. Dressed in a dark traveling cloak. Motionless. Silent. His face remained hidden beneath the shadow of his hood. Yet something about him felt different. While everyone else seemed eager for the ceremony to continue, he simply observed. Calm. Unmoving. Waiting. Aloan frowned. She had never seen him before. Aloan, the elder prompted again. Murmurs spread through the audience. Magnus' smile tightened slightly. Answer the question, he said. She looked away from the stranger and back toward the platform. The contract remained in her hands. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Aloan smiled. It was a small smile. Almost sad. Almost relieved. The kind of smile someone gives when they finally stop running from the truth. Gasps rippled through the crowd as she stepped toward one of the ceremonial torches burning beside the platform. Magnus straightened immediately. What are you doing? He asked. Aloan said nothing. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. The torchlight danced across the parchment. One more step. The elder rose from his seat. Aloan. Another step. Magnus' confidence vanished. Stop. She looked at the contract. Then at the faces surrounding her. Faces that expected obedience. Faces that believed her future belonged to them. Faces that had already decided who she would become. The realization settled quietly inside her. They were wrong. The edge of the parchment touched the flame. Fire blossomed instantly across the ancient paper. A collective gasp swept through Moonridge Pack. Golden light reflected in hundreds of stunned eyes. The contract curled as fire consumed it. Ash drifted upward into the night sky. Aloan watched it burn. Watched years of expectation disappear into smoke. For one breathtaking moment, absolute silence covered the square. Then chaos erupted. And from somewhere beyond the crowd, hidden beneath a dark hood, a pair of silver eyes finally brightened with unmistakable interest. The first person who ever made Aloan feel small was not an enemy. It was someone she once admired. As the ashes drifted into the night sky and shocked voices spread across Moonridge Square, A memory surfaced so clearly it felt as though she were living it again. 2 years earlier, she had been helping prepare decorations for the midwinter gathering. The council hall was crowded with guests, music, and laughter. Eloan remembered carrying boxes through a side corridor when she heard Magnus Thornvale speaking with several young alphas. She had not meant to listen. She had simply frozen when she heard her name. "You are really going through with it?" one of the men had asked. Magnus laughed. Eventually, more laughter followed. "Do not tell me you actually like her." Magnus shook his head. "Like her?" Another round of laughter echoed through the hallway. Then came the sentence Eloan never forgot. "She should be grateful I even considered her." The words struck harder than any insult. Eloan remembered standing perfectly still, hidden around the corner, waiting for someone to disagree. Nobody did. Instead, another voice asked, "Then why bother?" Magnus shrugged. "Because she is useful." Useful. The same word again. Always useful. Never kind. Never intelligent. Never brave. Never special. Just useful. Eloan had gone home early that night. She never told anyone why. She never confronted Magnus. She simply carried the hurt alone and convinced herself it did not matter. Standing beneath the lantern light now, she realized it had always mattered. The crowd continued whispering around her as smoke curled into the darkness above. Magnus looked frustrated, but Eloan barely heard him. More memories returned. Every time she offered an idea, and someone ignored it until a man repeated it. Every time she worked harder than everyone else and received half the recognition. Every time people described her future as though she were not standing in the room. The worst part was not the cruelty. It was how normal it became. "You embarrassed this entire pack," Magnus said, stepping toward her. His voice snapped her back to the present. Eloan looked at him, really looked at him. For years she had been intimidated by his confidence. Tonight she saw something different. A man who had spent so long getting his way that he never imagined hearing the word no. "Did I?" she asked quietly. Magnus frowned. "You burned an agreement witnessed by the entire pack." Eloan's heartbeat quickened. Not from fear. From clarity. "No," she replied. "I embarrassed a plan." Silence spread through the square. Several wolves exchanged surprised glances. Magnus stared at her. Eloan continued before doubt could stop her. "A plan that never cared what I wanted." The words seemed to settle over the crowd. Some wolves looked uncomfortable. Others looked thoughtful. A few lowered their eyes completely, because they knew she was right. "You never asked me," Eloan said. Her voice remained steady despite the emotion tightening in her chest. "Not once." Magnus opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. The truth was too simple to argue with. Eloan felt years of disappointment rising to the surface. "Do you know what hurts the most?" she asked. Nobody spoke. "It is not the contract." She glanced around the square. "It is realizing how many people already decided who I was before they ever bothered to know me." The silence deepened. Somewhere near the back of the crowd, a young Omega wiped tears from her eyes. An older woman folded her arms and nodded slowly. Eloan suddenly realized she was not the only one carrying invisible wounds. Then she felt it again. That strange awareness she had noticed since the ceremony began. Her eyes moved instinctively toward the edge of the gathering. The stranger in the dark cloak remained there, watching. Unlike everyone else, he did not look shocked by her words. He looked as though he had been waiting years to hear them. And for reasons she could not explain, that frightened her far less than the possibility that he understood every one of them. The crowd should have been angry. Instead, they looked uncertain. That frightened Magnus Thornvale far more than anger ever could. Eloan noticed it immediately. The moment doubt entered a room, control became difficult to maintain. Rain drifted softly through the lantern light as whispers spread from one side of Moonridge Square to the other. Wolves were no longer talking about the burned agreement. They were talking about her. About why she had done it. About whether she was right. For years, nobody had questioned anything. Tonight, questions were everywhere. "You are making a serious mistake," Magnus said. His voice was calmer now, but the confidence underneath it felt forced. "You are letting emotions cloud your judgment." Eloan almost laughed. That was always the answer. Whenever someone challenged a decision, they were emotional. Whenever someone powerful made a decision, it was practical. She had heard that excuse her entire life. "Am I?" she asked quietly. Magnus stepped closer. "You are throwing away a future most people would be grateful to have." The words hit harder than he intended, not because they hurt, because they reminded her of another memory, one she had tried very hard to forget. Last spring, during a council banquet, Aloan had been helping clear tables after dinner. The guests believed the room was empty. They believed nobody could hear them. Magnus sat near the fireplace with several friends, speaking freely. Aloan remembered carrying a tray through the doorway when one of the men asked, "So when is the ceremony?" Magnus smiled. "Soon." "And she agreed?" Another man asked. Magnus laughed. "She does not know it yet." The group chuckled. Aloan stopped walking. Her stomach tightened. Then came the sentence that stayed with her for months. "Girls like Aloan do not get options." The room erupted with laughter. Aloan remembered gripping the tray so tightly her hands hurt. Nobody defended her. Nobody corrected him. Nobody even seemed surprised. As though the statement was completely normal. She left before anyone noticed she was there. That night, she sat awake until sunrise, staring at the moon outside her bedroom window. For the first time, she asked herself a question she had spent years avoiding. What if they never intended to give me a choice? Standing in the square now, she finally knew the answer. They never had. "You keep talking about my future," Aloan said softly. The crowd gradually fell silent again. But every version of that future was created by someone else. Magnus frowned. "That is not true." "Then tell me when I was allowed to decide." Silence. The question hung in the air. Magnus searched for an answer. None came. Because there wasn't one. Aloan felt years of disappointment rising inside her. Not sharp. Not explosive. Just heavy. "Do you know what finally changed?" she asked. Nobody spoke. "I stopped asking whether I was good enough." Her voice trembled slightly before growing stronger. "And started asking why everyone expected me to accept so little." The words struck the crowd harder than she expected. Several wolves lowered their eyes. Others exchanged uneasy glances. Because deep down, many of them knew exactly what she meant. Then something unexpected happened. A young Omega near the back of the square spoke. Barely above a whisper. "I thought I was the only one." The statement seemed to ripple through the gathering. Another woman nodded. Then another. Aloan stared in surprise. For so long she believed her loneliness belonged only to her. Now she realized many others carried the same quiet wounds. Across the square, Magnus looked increasingly frustrated. Every passing minute pulled the conversation further from his control. Then Aloan felt it again. The sensation she could not explain. Her eyes moved toward the edge of the crowd. The stranger in the dark cloak remained there. Silent. Watching. Yet something had changed. He was no longer standing apart from the gathering. He had moved closer. Much closer. Close enough for moonlight to catch the silver of his eyes. Close enough for Aloan to notice the strange expression on his face. Not surprise. Not curiosity. Recognition. As though the answer he had spent years searching for was standing right in front of him and had finally found the courage to speak. For the first time all night, Aloan wished she could disappear. The courage that had carried her through the ceremony was beginning to crack. The crowd was still watching. The whispers were still spreading. And now that the shock had faded, doubt began slipping into places she thought she had sealed shut. What if Magnus was right? The question appeared suddenly and refused to leave. What if she had destroyed the only future she was ever going to have? The thought settled heavily in her chest. She hated herself for even considering it. Yet fear had a way of speaking with familiar voices. Voices she had heard her entire life. Be grateful. Do not ask for too much. Do not make things difficult. Aloan looked around Moonridge Square. Some wolves appeared supportive. Others looked confused. A few openly disapproved. The sight made her stomach tighten. She had spent years avoiding attention. Now every eye seemed fixed on her. "Look what you have done," Magnus said. His voice was quieter now, almost reasonable. Somehow that made it worse. "People are talking." Aloan swallowed hard. They were always talking. Not like this. He stepped closer. "You think they admire what you did." The words struck deeper than she wanted to admit. Because part of her feared he was right. Magnus lowered his voice. "Tomorrow this will be all anyone remembers." Aloan looked away. He continued. "The Omega who embarrassed herself in front of the entire pack." Her heartbeat quickened. The old Aloan would have believed him. The old Aloan would have apologized. She would have tried to fix everything. Yet another part of her refused to surrender. The two versions of herself seemed to collide inside her chest. One built from fear. The other built from truth. Then she noticed something. Nobody was laughing. Nobody. Not a single person. If Magnus' prediction were true, why did nobody look entertained? Why did they look thoughtful instead? Uncertain? Troubled? The realization created the smallest crack in her doubt. Then a familiar voice spoke from the crowd. That is not what I will remember. Heads turned immediately. Clara Winslow stepped forward. The older woman folded her arms. I will remember someone finally saying no. Silence followed. Another voice emerged. So will I. Then another. Me too. Eloan stared in disbelief. The support was not loud. It was not dramatic. Yet somehow that made it more powerful. These were ordinary wolves. Ordinary people. People with nothing to gain. One by one, they chose honesty. Magnus' expression tightened. His confidence seemed to weaken with every passing second. Yet Eloan's attention shifted elsewhere. Because she suddenly became aware of something strange. The mysterious man in the dark cloak was moving again. Slowly. Deliberately. He was no longer standing near the edge of the square. He was walking toward the center. The crowd seemed to part without realizing it. Wolves stepped aside instinctively. Eloan watched him approach. Her pulse quickened. Not from fear this time. From curiosity. The closer he came, the more she noticed details she had missed before. The quality of the cloak. The calm confidence in his stride. The way he seemed completely unaffected by the tension surrounding him. Most people looked nervous tonight. He looked certain, as though he had known exactly how this evening would unfold. Magnus noticed him too. Who are you? He demanded. The stranger stopped several yards away. Moonlight reflected faintly from beneath his hood. Someone who dislikes seeing courage mistaken for foolishness, he replied. The words settled over the crowd like a sudden gust of wind. Eloan felt her breath catch. Nobody had defended her like that before. Not publicly. Not ever. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the square. Silver eyes beneath the shadow of a hood. Calm. Steady. Unshaken. And for reasons she could not explain, Eloan felt something she had not felt all evening. Hope. Hope lasted only a few seconds before fear returned. Eloan hated that about herself. One kind word could lift her. One harsh thought could pull her back down. As the stranger's defense echoed through Moonridge Square, she felt dozens of eyes turned toward her again. The attention was exhausting. For years, she had learned how to disappear into the background. Tonight there was nowhere to hide. Magnus Thornvale recovered quickly. Courage, he said with a bitter laugh. You call this courage? He gestured toward the ashes scattered across the stone. She destroyed her future because she was afraid of responsibility. Several wolves looked uncomfortable. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Eloan felt her stomach tighten. Part of her wanted to argue. Another part wanted to leave. To go home. To escape the crowd, the whispers, and the crushing weight of being everyone's topic of conversation. Maybe that was what hurt the most. She had finally spoken for herself, yet somehow she still felt alone. Magnus seemed to notice the doubt flickering across her face. Tell me honestly, Eloan, he said. His voice softened. What happens tomorrow? The question hit harder than she expected. Tomorrow. She had been so focused on surviving tonight that she had barely thought about tomorrow. Magnus took another step forward. What happens when everyone moves on? Silence. What happens when nobody offers you another opportunity? Eloan looked away. The words found every insecurity she had spent years trying to hide. Magnus continued. What happens when you realize you threw everything away? For a terrifying moment, she had no answer. The crowd blurred slightly. The lanterns seemed dimmer. The confidence that carried her through the ceremony suddenly felt very far away. Maybe she really had made a mistake. Maybe she had confused courage with recklessness. Maybe everyone would remember her as the woman who ruined her own future. The thought settled heavily in her chest. Then she remembered something. Not a speech. Not advice. A memory. 3 winters earlier, a blizzard had stranded several elderly wolves outside town. Most people stayed home because the roads were dangerous. Eloan spent 6 hours helping bring supplies to families who needed them. Nobody asked her to do it. Nobody rewarded her afterward. Yet she remembered how she felt that night. Tired. Frozen. Proud. Because she knew she had done the right thing. The memory cut through the fear like sunlight through clouds. For years, every meaningful decision she made had been based on one simple question. Is it right? Not easy. Not popular. Right. Slowly, Eloan lifted her head. I do not know what happens tomorrow, she admitted. The honesty surprised everyone. But I know what would have happened if I signed. Silence spread across the square. I would have spent the rest of my life wondering why I betrayed myself. The words landed heavily. Magnus opened his mouth to respond, but she continued before he could. Maybe I will struggle. Her voice grew stronger. Maybe people will criticize me. Maybe some already are. She glanced around the crowd. But at least the choice was mine. A deep stillness settled over Moonridge. Not because everyone agreed. Because everyone understood. Even those who disagreed understood. For the first time all evening, Aloan felt the fear begin to loosen its grip. Then she noticed something extraordinary. The stranger in the dark cloak was smiling. Not a large smile. Barely visible. Yet it carried genuine admiration. As though she had just passed some invisible test. The realization sent a strange shiver through her. Who was this man? Why did his opinion matter? Before she could answer either question, movement stirred near the back of the crowd. An older merchant who had recently arrived from the Northern Territories stared at the cloaked stranger with widening eyes. His face drained of color. He took one uncertain step forward. Then another. The entire square watched him. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke the words that changed everything. That cannot be. His eyes never left the stranger. Your Majesty? The word struck Moonridge Square like a bolt of lightning. Your Majesty. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Aloan stared at the merchant who had spoken, wondering if she had heard him correctly. Then she looked toward the stranger. The man did not react with surprise. He did not deny it. He simply stood beneath the moonlight, calm and composed, as though the truth had finally caught up with him. A murmur swept through the crowd. Wolves exchanged stunned glances. Several immediately lowered their heads. Others looked frozen in disbelief. Magnus Thornvale's face lost all color. Vera Holloway seemed unable to speak. Aloan's pulse thundered in her ears. Her eyes remained fixed on the stranger. Suddenly, every strange detail from the evening made sense. The confidence. The calm. The way people instinctively moved aside when he walked. The way he watched everything without needing anyone's approval. The merchant swallowed hard. I saw him once in Northwatch, he said nervously. At a regional summit. His voice trembled. That is King Ronan Blackthorn. Silence followed. Then the stranger finally reached up and lowered the hood from his head. Gasps spread through the square. Moonlight illuminated silver eyes and features every wolf in the Northern Territories recognized from portraits, official gatherings, and stories passed from pack to pack. King Ronan Blackthorn. The Alpha King himself. Aloan felt her breath catch. She had seen paintings of him before. Every wolf had. Yet standing a few feet away from the real man felt completely different. He seemed less distant than the legends. Less untouchable. More real. And somehow that made his presence even more powerful. Around them, wolves bowed their heads. Magnus looked as though he wanted to disappear. The entire evening had slipped beyond his control. Ronan glanced briefly toward the crowd. You may stand, he said calmly. The simple command carried across the square with effortless authority. Slowly, wolves lifted their heads. Yet nobody looked away from him. Nobody could. Then Ronan's attention shifted toward Aloan. The noise of the crowd seemed to fade. Once again, she felt as though she were the only person standing there. You asked a question tonight that should have been asked years ago, he said. Aloan frowned slightly. What question? Ronan studied her for a moment. Why your future belonged to everyone except you. The words settled deep inside her chest. Because that had always been the real issue. Not the contract. Not the ceremony. Choice. Her choice. Ronan nodded slightly, as though confirming something to himself. I have traveled across these territories for many years, he continued. I have met leaders, warriors, scholars, and advisors. The crowd listened carefully. Most people are very good at protecting traditions. His silver eyes hardened slightly. Far fewer are willing to challenge them when they become unjust. A deep silence followed. Magnus looked away. Several council members shifted uncomfortably. Ronan noticed. So did everyone else. Then the Alpha King looked back at Aloan. You stood alone tonight. His voice softened. Most people would have signed the paper simply to avoid disappointing others. Aloan felt emotion tightening in her throat. Because he understood. Not just what she did. Why she did it. But you did not. Moonlight reflected in his eyes. That takes courage. For years, people had called her many things. Quiet. Obedient. Useful. Difficult. Never courageous. The word struck harder than she expected. Then Ronan took a slow step forward. The crowd instinctively leaned closer. Every wolf in Moonridge seemed aware that something important was unfolding. Aloan's heartbeat quickened again. The Alpha King studied her with an expression she could not quite understand. Not curiosity, not surprise. Something warmer. Something earned. "I did not come to Moonridge expecting to find someone like you," he said quietly. The admission seemed to surprise even him. Then a faint smile appeared. "And yet here you are." The words lingered between them as moonlight spilled across the square. And for the first time all evening, Aloan realized the Alpha King was no longer looking at her as a stranger. The way King Ronan Blackthorn looked at her was what unsettled Aloan the most. Not because he was the Alpha King, not because every wolf in Moonridge stood frozen in shock, but because he seemed to see something in her that she had never been able to see in herself. The realization made her uncomfortable. For years, she had been invisible. Invisible people learned how to avoid attention. They learned how to shrink themselves. Yet tonight there was nowhere left to hide. Moonlight spilled across the square as silence stretched between them. Around them, the crowd remained completely absorbed. Nobody wanted to miss a single word. Ronan glanced briefly toward the mountains beyond Moonridge before returning his attention to Aloan. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. The question surprised her. Kings usually gave orders. They did not ask permission. Aloan nodded. Ronan's expression grew thoughtful. 3 years ago, I almost stopped searching." A ripple of curiosity moved through the crowd. Aloan frowned slightly. "Searching for what?" A faint smile appeared. "Someone worth finding." The answer deepened the mystery rather than solving it. Ronan seemed to realize that. He looked toward the stars overhead as though revisiting old memories. "The territories are full of people who want power," he said. "People who want titles, influence, recognition." Several wolves lowered their eyes. "Finding those people is easy." His voice softened. "Finding people with character is much harder." Aloan listened carefully. Something about his tone felt personal, as though he was not speaking as a king. "As a man, every lead I followed ended the same way," Ronan continued. "Impressive reputations. Disappointing people." A few wolves laughed quietly. Even Aloan smiled. Then a report reached me from a traveling merchant. He glanced toward her. A small report, barely worth mentioning. Aloan folded her arms. "What did it say?" Ronan's smile widened slightly. It described a young woman who spent 6 hours helping elderly wolves during a winter storm. Aloan blinked. Of all the things he could have mentioned, she never expected that. "That was years ago." "I know. And it was nothing special." Ronan's expression changed immediately. "That is where you are wrong." Silence followed. The words landed harder than she expected. "Most people help when others are watching," he said. "Very few help when nobody is keeping score." Aloan looked away. She did not know how to respond. Throughout her life, she had dismissed her own kindness as ordinary, necessary, nothing worth discussing. Yet somehow this man saw it differently. Ronan continued. "After that report came another, then another." Curiosity spread through the crowd. A woman who balanced records for struggling merchants. A woman who organized food deliveries after a flood. A woman who never accepted credit for any of it. Aloan felt heat rising to her cheeks. She wanted the conversation to stop, not because it embarrassed her, because she genuinely never expected anyone to remember those things. "You investigated me?" she asked. Ronan almost laughed. Not intentionally. The crowd chuckled softly. The stories simply kept appearing. Then his expression grew serious again. "The interesting part was that nobody described you the same way." Aloan frowned. "What do you mean?" "Some called you stubborn. A few people smiled. Others called you patient." More smiles followed. "Some called you too quiet." Aloan sighed. That sounded familiar. Ronan nodded. But every story shared one thing. The square fell silent again. Whenever someone needed help, your name appeared. The words settled over Moonridge like falling snow. Simple, honest, impossible to dismiss. Aloan felt something tighten in her chest. Not sadness, not fear, recognition. For years she had measured herself through the eyes of people like Magnus. Through criticism, through rejection, through expectations she could never satisfy. Yet standing here now, she was hearing a completely different version of her life. One she had never allowed herself to see. Ronan studied her carefully. Then he took one slow step forward. His silver eyes held a warmth she had not noticed before. "I thought I came here searching for answers," he said quietly. "Now I think I came here to meet you. And for the first time since the ceremony began, Aloan's heart forgot how to protect itself. Aloan should have looked away. That was what the old version of her would have done. The girl who spent years apologizing for taking up space. The girl who learned to make herself smaller whenever attention became uncomfortable. But she could not look away now. Not from King Ronan Blackthorn. Not from the sincerity in his eyes. Not after everything that had happened. Moonridge Square had become completely silent. The crowd watched them beneath a sky washed clean by rain. Lanterns flickered softly in the night breeze. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled across the mountains, the sound carrying through the valley before fading into the darkness. Aloan felt her heart pounding against her ribs. "Why?" she asked quietly. The question escaped before she could stop it. Ronan tilted his head slightly. "Why what? Why me?" The words hung between them. Raw. Honest. Years of doubt lived inside that simple question. Why me? Why would anyone search for me? Why would anyone notice me? Why would someone like you care what happens to someone like me? The crowd remained still. No one interrupted. Ronan's expression softened in a way that made him seem less like a king and more like a man carrying his own scars. "Because I was wrong for a very long time," he said. Aloan frowned. She had not expected that answer. "Wrong?" Ronan nodded slowly. "I spent years believing strength was easy to recognize." His gaze drifted briefly toward the mountains. Warriors. Leaders. People who commanded attention whenever they entered a room. A faint smile appeared. People like Magnus. Several wolves shifted uncomfortably. Ronan continued. "Then I learned something." His silver eyes returned to hers. "The strongest people are usually the ones nobody notices." The words settled over the square. The people who keep showing up after being overlooked. The people who continue being kind after being disappointed. The people who help others without expecting applause. Aloan felt tears threatening to rise again. Because every sentence felt painfully personal. Ronan took another step closer. "Do you know the greatest mistake this pack ever made?" The question startled everyone. Even Magnus looked up. Silence stretched across the square. Then Ronan answered it himself. "They convinced you that you were ordinary." A collective stillness swept through Moonridge. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The words struck Aloan harder than anything she had heard all night. For years she had measured herself against people who barely saw her. She had accepted their judgment as truth. Accepted their silence as proof that she did not matter. And now someone was telling her the opposite. "You spent years trying to earn a value you already possessed," Ronan said quietly. "That was never your burden to carry." Aloan felt a tear slip down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. For once, she did not care who saw. Around them, many wolves looked emotional. Clara Winslow lowered her head. Daniel Mercer smiled sadly. Even some of the people who once ignored Aloan now looked ashamed. They remembered. They remembered every time she helped. Every time she gave. Every time she was taken for granted. Ronan looked around the square. "Tonight, all of you witnessed something remarkable." His voice carried clearly through the valley. A woman chose her self-respect over her fear. Then he turned back toward Aloan. The world seemed to narrow until only the two of them remained. Moonlight reflected in his silver eyes. The breeze stirred the edges of his dark coat. And before anyone could anticipate what would happen next, King Ronan Blackthorn slowly lowered himself onto one knee. Gasps swept across the crowd. Several wolves covered their mouths. Others stared in disbelief. Magnus looked completely stunned. Aloan forgot how to breathe. The most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories knelt before her. Not because tradition required it. Not because anyone expected it. Because he chose to. Ronan lifted his gaze toward her. Respect shone clearly in his eyes. "They spent years making you feel invisible," he said softly. "Tonight they will finally see you." And in that moment, every person in Moonridge Square understood that the story they would remember for the rest of their lives had just begun. No one remembered to breathe. The entire square stood frozen beneath the moonlight as King Ronan Blackthorn remained on one knee before Aloan Ashcroft. It was the kind of moment people spent the rest of their lives talking about. The kind of moment that became legend long before anyone realized it. Aloan stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear anything else. For years she had imagined what justice might feel like. She imagined someone finally defending her. Someone finally understanding her. But she had never imagined this. Not because a king knelt before her. Because someone had finally spoken the truth she needed to hear. They spent years making you feel invisible. Tonight they will finally see you. The words echoed through her chest. Around them, Moonridge Pack remained completely silent. Many wolves looked emotional. Others looked ashamed. Some simply looked stunned. For the first time, they were not seeing Aloan through old assumptions. They were seeing her through her actions, through her courage, through the countless quiet things she had done when nobody was watching. Ronan slowly rose to his feet. Yet somehow the impact of the gesture remained. Nothing could erase what everyone had just witnessed. Magnus Thornvale stood near the edge of the crowd, speechless. The certainty that once surrounded him had vanished completely. Aloan looked at him for only a moment. Then she looked away. Not because she was angry, because she no longer needed anything from him. Not his approval, not his attention, not his opinion. The realization felt strangely peaceful. For years she thought freedom meant being chosen. Tonight she discovered freedom meant choosing herself. A gentle breeze moved through the valley. The last traces of smoke from the burned agreement had long since disappeared into the night sky. Moonlight reflected across the wet stones where the ceremony had begun hours earlier. The square looked exactly the same. Yet everything had changed. Ronan stepped beside her and looked toward the crowd. "Remember this night," he said calmly. His voice carried across the valley. Not because a contract was destroyed. He paused. Because a woman refused to surrender her worth. Silence followed. Powerful silence. The kind people carried home with them. Clara Winslow wiped away tears. Daniel Mercer nodded quietly. Even wolves who barely knew Aloan seemed affected by the moment. They understood what had happened here. Not just to her. To all of them. Because courage has a way of giving other people permission to be brave too. Aloan looked up toward the stars. The clouds were gone now. The sky stretched endlessly above Moonridge Valley. For the first time in years, she felt lighter. Not because every problem had disappeared. Not because the future was suddenly certain. But because the future finally belonged to her. She thought about the frightened girl who once stood in hallways listening to people decide her life. The girl who accepted every dismissal, every insult, every disappointment. That girl felt very far away now. Somewhere along the journey, she had become someone stronger. Someone willing to say no. Someone willing to risk being disliked rather than betray herself. The realization brought a small smile to her lips. Beside her, Ronan noticed. He smiled too. Not the smile of a king celebrating a victory. The smile of a man relieved to see someone recognize their own value. The crowd gradually began to disperse. Families returned home. Conversations drifted through the valley. Yet many wolves glanced back one last time before leaving, as though they understood they had witnessed something rare. Eventually, only a few people remained. The lanterns flickered softly. The mountains stood silent beneath the moon. Aloan looked down at the place where the ashes had fallen. Earlier that night, she thought she was destroying her future. Now she understood what really happened. The fire had not destroyed a future. It had destroyed a cage. A breeze swept across the square, carrying the last invisible traces of ash into the darkness beyond the valley. For years, other people tried to decide who Aloan Ashcroft should become. Tonight, even the ashes could not find her. Because for the first time in her life, she belonged to herself.